I'm just really thrilled to welcome the 15th Administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, Amit Bose.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks, Jim. Thank you to the Rail Passengers Association and Jim for having me at your spring summit. Great to be here and see all of you in person. I know I saw some of you virtually last late spring, fall. It's a privilege for me to be here. Today I want to talk about FRA's priorities and how we're advancing them. And I want to talk about the opportunities created by President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law and the implementation steps Secretary Buttigieg has underway. Most of all, I want to talk about how we can work together to advance and accelerate rail development to improve safety, performance, job opportunities, resiliency, and efficiency. My time here today is another opportunity to further productive and collaborative relationship between our organizations and produce results that benefit the American public. And today happens to be the day that President Biden is going to release the fiscal year 23 budget proposal. So look out for that later in the day. And as you all know, the President is perhaps the strongest supporter and best known user of Amtrak we've ever had. The President has demonstrated his commitment to rail early with his American Rescue Plan, which provided $1.7 billion to Amtrak. This influx of funding, along with COVID relief funding, amounting to over $1 billion from the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES Act in 2020, and $998 million from the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act in 2021 allowed Amtrak to recall employees furloughed due to the pandemic, restore daily long-distance routes, and help states cover the lost revenue on state-supported routes. After the American Rescue Plan, President Biden worked with Congress on the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has given us unprecedented opportunities to modernize and grow rail in America. In fact, the law is a 500% increase over recent funding levels for rail in America. This will be transformational and open a new era for rail in the United States. I know Ryan Arbuckle from FRA joined you in January to go over the things that the bill contained and share the incredibly exciting investments to be made through FRA's existing and new grant programs. We have a great website, railroads.dot.gov/BIL for more details. We'll be sure to share that with you. Most of you already probably know that, but it's important to keep that website in mind. In raw numbers, the infrastructure law provides $44 billion for FRA's competitive discretionary grant programs, $22 billion in direct grants to Amtrak. The law invests deeper into existing FRA grant programs, such as the Federal-State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program. That's going to be the primary program for opportunities for intercity rail, whether it's conventional rail or high-speed rail. Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grant Program, CRISI. The law also creates funding opportunities and establishes new programs like the Corridor Identification and Development Program. I've already seen RPA's comments that you submitted, and thank you for doing that. The Railroad Crossing Elimination Program and the Interstate Rail Compacts Program, which is an important one. For too long, rail lacked dedicated and sustained federal funding. This is no longer the case. And again, I want to thank RPA for your efforts to turn that into a reality. We can't lose sight of the bipartisan law's $36 billion in authorized annual funding over the next 5 years. That's why we need to track the President's fiscal year 23 budget proposal and what Congress does. We've been advocating for this moment for a long time. Now, let's seize it and execute. I meant to share this a little bit earlier, but I do want to talk about this just briefly and just share what a small world it really is. When I was growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, I had a friend, a good friend. His name was Ben Yorker, and his dad was Alan Yorker, who's the past president, one of your past presidents here. And Mr. Yorker, Dr. Yorker, was a big influence on my life and definitely helped me and set me on the path to college at Columbia University, where he went for undergrad. I had no idea that he was going to be president of RPA in the future, but it's just quite a coincidence that he went on to become RPA president, and especially from a place like Atlanta, of all places, as we know, that has been depleted of passenger rail service for a long time. And I'm sure advocates like him, and I know that advocates like him in Georgia are working hard every day to bring more robust service to Atlanta. And one fact that's amazing is that Savannah has more stops or more routes for passenger rail than Atlanta does, believe it or not, even though huge population gap between the two. As a department, the DOT is focused on advancing safe, efficient, equitable, and climate-friendly transportation alternatives for our citizens. And I want to emphasize the safety part, because I know we all paid attention to the derailment that happened in Montana on September 25th. I know I'm not going to forget it. Train number 7, the Empire Builder, and that was a shocking derailment, and the fatalities that resulted. The investigation is ongoing. FRA is working hand in hand with the NTSB on it, but it's just a reminder that at the core, the safety and safe operations of passenger rail are so critical to making sure that passengers use it more and more. The department and the Federal Railroad Administration are paying close attention to the issue of Gulf Coast restoration. As I said during my testimony before the Surface Transportation Board a few weeks ago, the American public suffers when they don't have access to intercity passenger rail service. The Gulf Coast region has been without Amtrak service for nearly 2 decades, and service delayed is service denied. I can't say this enough. Freight and passenger rail has and can coexist in America to move goods and people. They already do so every day. I've recently marked several public-private partnerships moving forward that demonstrate this fact. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, I joined the Wisconsin and Minnesota Departments of Transportation plus the Illinois Department of Transportation to celebrate a planned second daily round trip between Union Depot in St. Paul and Union Station in Chicago via Milwaukee. This service will provide commuters and travelers with more reliable, more convenient rail options. Efforts like this one illustrate multiple states, host railroads, and Amtrak's collaborating. That's why the bipartisan infrastructure laws, interstate compacts, corridor identification, and Amtrak long-distance study provisions will be useful tools to advance multi-state projects. And then in Pittsburgh, in February, we announced an operating agreement between Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and Norfolk Southern to improve the Keystone West Line, reducing freight congestion and increasing supply chain fluidity. Doubling passenger rail service frequency on the line will also mean more options and greater convenience for passengers. As an administration, we're committed to growing the economy, creating good-paying jobs, increasing equity, and addressing climate change. We all have to regularly share how these bipartisan infrastructure dollars will improve Americans' lives. and I'm counting on you all to do that. There is a number of actions underway that I want to highlight in alignment with our commitment. FRA recently published for review and comment our proposed guidance to address statutory labor protection requirements for railroad employees who are affected by projects receiving FRA grant funds. The comment period is open until April 18th, and we encourage prospective grantees to provide comments. FRA is also conducting a nationwide minority-owned business and women-owned business enterprise disparity study to see whether FRA needs a disadvantaged business enterprise program that FHWA, FTA, and FAA already have. Workforce development and Buy America are also important components of our implementation efforts. On the climate front, please be on the lookout for an exciting update on FRA's climate-related efforts to be announced around Earth Day next month. I have made sure that FRA also has the resources to play its role to fight climate change. I want to remind you that funding opportunities with the potential to improve rail are available right now. Last week, Secretary Buttigieg announced $2.9 billion in infrastructure law funding available for major infrastructure projects of regional and national significance, including in that announcement that are the National Infrastructure Project Assistance or MEGA grants and Infrastructure for Rebuilding America, INFRA, which can be used for rail projects.
When you and I talked about this, I said we're going to have some folks that are remote, some folks here, so we're going to start there. So this one comes from our friend Danny Flower at the Virginia Strong Speed Rail. And what are the biggest one or two lessons learned by the FRA from the challenges of the FRA passenger rail program, and how are those lessons impacting the implementation of JOBS Act?
Sure. So very good question, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about before I started in 2021 in the new administration, ever since I worked on the Recovery Act in 2009, and then I left the administration in January of 2017. Some of the lessons learned actually start even before the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. They start with predictable, dedicated funding. The FAST Act created new grant programs and provided consistent funding. It prompted FRA to develop and enhance internal tools and processes to handle that influx of funding. So actually, FRA has a good baseline to work from for these additional grant programs that we're getting. The magnitude is at a whole nother level, but we do have experiences at this point with grants that we didn't have as much of when the Recovery Act came online. As I've said, and I may have sounded like a broken record in repeating this, but stakeholder engagement and relationship building are absolutely essential. And there's some reasons for that too. We're very serious when we're saying that we want our equity principles to reflect or be reflected in the applications that get selected and the applicants that get chosen. So that means entities like tribes, some cities, again, non-traditional applicants with the FRA. We really encourage them to apply. But that means making sure they have the technical capability and resources to submit applications. That's why we're doing so many of the webinars. That's why we're going to offer technical assistance on a continuous basis. Also, another lessons learned was to have metrics and attainable benefits. Outlining metrics and attainable project benefits at the start of a project can highlight the program's successes, identify industry trends, and really lead to continued funding. And some finer details too. We learned in particular that right-of-way acquisition advanced right-of-way acquisition can be very, very helpful to projects. Also, we're definitely cognizant that through the environmental process, in a lot of absolutely appropriate ways, projects can change to meet and address community issues that pop up during the environmental process. But those processes lead to changes in the project design, changes in the project cost, and we all have to be prepared for that. Also, at a certain point, it's also got to be pencils down on those efforts. So it's a balance that we have to maintain, but those are just some quick lessons learned from the Recovery Act experience. And I'll just say one more thing about the Recovery Act. When I talk about that dedicated sustained funding, I think this is absolutely reflective of the lessons learned, is that many of the folks in the White House, including the President himself, was involved with the Recovery Act and implementing the Recovery Act. And I think one lesson learned was that $8 billion, as big of a number as it is not going to meet the demands that we have in this country for rail. This time around, we have $66 billion. But I fully know the needs and demands that are out there, and I know that $66 billion actually is a down payment on those needs. But it's foundational, and it's absolutely going to have the building blocks we need in place. But another important point also is that in terms of the public and folks like you who follow all these things closely, is readiness. Now, imagine $66 billion just all of a sudden appearing, and that's really what happened. It took a long time to get there, but it happened. Now we're in the implementation phase. Now we're in the phase where project sponsors are going to have to put together strong projects and are going to have to do things to dot the I's, cross the T's in order to move forward. So it's really important at this particular juncture that applicants and project sponsors get to the right place in terms of readiness. Now, having said that, we absolutely have things that are closer to being ready to go, and others not so much. But that's why we, again, lesson learned is we have a pipeline, or we're going to work towards having a pipeline of projects so that everything doesn't happen in year one, everything doesn't happen in year two. We want to set things up so that, and line things up so that things do happen in year 5, so that sets the stage for beyond year 5. We don't have a rail trust fund. We do have advance appropriations, and that's what I liken to dedicated and sustained funding. But we want to go beyond those 5 years. We also know through the Recovery Act, some projects are going to take a long time to build. That's the nature of these projects. They are mega projects. The Hudson River Tunnel project is a project the likes of which we haven't seen in over 100 years. We're doing things, we're going to build things that are going to last for over 100 years. We're doing things right now. We're doing things that in the past few decades, unfortunately, weren't done, and there's a backlog of needs. And absolutely essential in this is making sure that Amtrak has a robust program within itself and has the right capacity within itself to deliver on the $22 billion that it got or is going to get directly.
Thanks. And you know, you and I talked about this a bunch of times before. You know, you talked about stakeholder engagement. And one of the questions that we got here from our friend Stu Nicholson in Oliver, Ohio, kind of touches on that. And I've been going around the country speaking to our member groups and so forth, and kind of trying to deliver the same idea that this is the moment for our local folks to engage their mayors, their congressional delegations, their state DOTs. And so Stu asks, in particular, you know, why is it so important for states like Ohio to raise their hand and formally engage with the FRA and Amtrak on the passenger rail expansion plans in a timely way? And do you have a message for states with leaders like, say, Governor DeWine, you know, folks who are on the fence or even hostile?
Well, I'd say my first message point would be the federal government has a robust, dedicated and sustained rail program now. And the Ohio Department of Transportation should continue to put resources into the rail part of its Department of Transportation. That's absolutely essential, and we really want state departments of transportation to make the investments or look at making the investments they need to make to advance passenger rail. Another point that I want to emphasize again is the corridor identification and development program is such an important opportunity to provide an opportunity for input from stakeholders, whether they be states or organizations or individuals, because it really does set a statutory grounded framework for the future development of intercity passenger rail service throughout the country. These corridors that we're going to look at are going to be the framework going forward. The bipartisan infrastructure law calls for public sector entities like states, local governments, public agencies, and federally recognized Indian tribes and others to partner with FRA to develop proposals that will be selected into the program. So that's going to be a really, really important opportunity, but also to look at existing grant opportunities, the ones I mentioned, RAISE, which the application deadline is coming up. Also, the MEGA grant program, the INFRA grant program. There is plenty of funding available. The states have themselves been telling us that they have a lot of demands and needs. Well, the federal government and Congress and the president delivered. And so now it's your turn to take the baton and move forward on those projects.
Thanks a lot. I have a few more, but I think I do want to let some of the folks here in the audience, I can see that we don't have a whole lot of questions. I'll start on this side and then I'll kind of go over there.
Sir, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a demonstration train that ran from New Orleans to Jacksonville. It was packed with politicians, Amtrak representatives, and other government representatives. There's a lot of fanfare. It seems to have stalled out. I'd like to hear your perspective on what is the feasibility of restoring that route and what are the impediments to doing so.
It's a great question. So I happen to be on that train when it ran in 2016.
Me too.
I got off in Gulfport, but the Gulf Coast service that you're talking about, I mentioned in my remarks, is absolutely front and center. It is going to be pivotal because of the future of how the Surface Transportation Board deals with matters like that one in those hopefully rare instances where there's an impasse between the railroads and Amtrak, and the Surface Transportation Board has to engage. What we're doing also in the meantime is making sure that the infrastructure is going to be there in place, that when those trains do start running, that they're operationally capable of handling that new service. That means upgrading facilities. That means making sure the stations can accommodate trains that haven't, passenger trains that haven't stopped there in decades. So we're making sure all those details are sorted out so that when the surface transportation hopefully makes a decision favorable, the service can get up and running. It's going to be important to have the states engaged in that. It's unfortunate for me to see in particular the approach that Alabama has taken on that service, and it shouldn't be a choice of either or between freight, rail, port development, and passenger rail. Those things can all work together.
Could not agree more. Phil, I know you had your hand up?
Yeah. Thank you. So much. Phil Spivey, Indiana. A few years ago, we had a presenter talk about how the interstate highway system was created by a government agency at the national level and then pushed that to the states for their implementation, since the federal government didn't have the legal capability to build highways. I think the result of that was a National Highway Administration with an office of some sort that promotes the use of highways. In your remarks today, you kind of alluded to your staff and the work that they have done. Would it be reasonable to create a National Passenger Rail Commission to study all of the necessary needs, wants, and desires, and then push that up to the states, rather than necessarily having the states or the individual organizations try to pull it from you? You could maybe combine the two, gather the information and push the information back out for implementation.
That's a great suggestion, and one I'll definitely take back with me. On the federal side, we have some constraints to an extent on how nimble we can be, and that means that these ideas and concepts sometimes take years to bring to fruition, but an idea like that one is absolutely worthwhile considering and makes a lot of sense. I'll say this, that in 2009-10, there was a national rail study, if I remember the terminology right, and there was a follow-up in 2010 or 2011, if my memory serves, and those are available on FRA's websites if those of you haven't had a chance to look at it. I'll just share, and this is a sort of a lesson learned from that time period. As soon as we put those out, there were immediate targets for people who don't necessarily want to advance rail in the country. And that's not to say we shouldn't have plans and efforts like I mentioned we already do with the Midwest effort, the Southwest effort, the one in the South and the Northeast. Whenever there's attention on that sort of effort, it just needs to be done in a thoughtful way, in the right way, with the right level of stakeholder engagement, and it's absolutely something we'll look at.
Before I say anything else, I want to say on behalf of everyone here, thank you for coming and speaking to us. It's very, very greatly appreciated. The question I have is actually kind of a follow-on to one of Jim's earlier questions. My name is Greg, I'm from Ohio, and he mentioned our governor, Governor DeWine, being, you said on the fence or hostile, and I know since you were in the previous administration, You probably are aware that the predecessor to Governor DeWine was openly hostile to rail. Interestingly, this morning, our local newspaper in Cleveland, the Plain Dealer, actually had an article about the prospects for developing new Amtrak service in Ohio. And the main takeaway from that was that the state of Ohio, including the Ohio Rail Development Commission, is being radio silent on what they want to do. However, there is significant interest from local and regional stakeholders along, in particular, the 3C corridor, as it historically was known, between Cleveland and Columbus, which of course is one of the biggest cities in the country without rail service, and Cincinnati, as well as Dayton, between the three of those. All of those cities and many smaller ones have passed resolutions in support, and there's an appetite for developing that service. We don't know what the position of the state is. And you said that engagement from states and DOTs is important. If you don't have that engagement, let's say that Ohio just remains like Switzerland, neutral as a state, and they're on the fence. If the state remains on the fence, but there's significant interest from, say, regional councils or local governments or local stakeholders, would that still help you in developing services where there's an appetite or a need for them, such as that 3C corridor?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that that's something we're going to see in other places as well. And what's going to be important are the details for obvious reasons, but there is a pathway to have entities within a state advance projects short of building them, to advance projects in the right way, and the bipartisan infrastructure law absolutely sets up those opportunities. But that engagement with the state is essential. And like you said, it's one thing if they're neutral, it's going to be something else if they're hostile. But I'd encourage those conversations to happen, and also within the state, it's the governor absolutely has a role, the state DOT, but the state legislatures do as well. So just getting the word out and sharing the support is something definitely to highlight and let the state DOT be aware of.
So before I have Bob ask his question, I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to put in a plug for Sean's workshop. One of the workshops we're going to be conducting is precisely on that point about how to take this next step of grassroots organizing to work on the local piece of this, which, as you said, is super important to advancing this process. So Bob and then Carl.
I face a situation in Tennessee where I live that there's been very little political, I don't know if it's changed or not. I had a politician tell me, he said, well, the people in Tennessee don't want us to spend money on passenger service, they're not interested in it. Which I thought was a pretty stupid statement to make, to tell you the truth. I won't tell you who said it, but somebody pretty well known in the state of Tennessee on the senator level. But I guess my question too to you, have you seen any more favorable response from Tennessee legislators or people? Have you seen any change in their attitude?
I have not,
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it's not out there. I don't get a chance to follow every development, but generally speaking, I haven't. But this gets back to another point where I think you all may want to, if you've done it, you may want to think about it more. I think that tools like studies and other efforts at generating information to share and demonstrating the level of interest and support for those future services is really, really important to do. And I mentioned localities and regional entities. I also think nonprofits and foundations and non-public entities can play a role too. In the West, a really good example of that is in Washington State, and I know that, you know, bringing up Microsoft's name is an entity all unto itself, but Microsoft did a lot to get things rolling on a future service that they're looking at out there. I know that Facebook looked at an additional crossing between, you know, on the bay in between San Francisco and the land part of California. So there's those efforts at a private sector level where the private sector recognizes how important these connections are. And I'd say also, I hope entities like chambers of commerce and other local entities that have business interests understand and know that opening up this avenue of transportation is just ends up benefiting the community overall, not only in terms of getting people from place A to place B, but also having ripple effects throughout the economy. So I just say that's one approach to take, but I'm fully aware that there are going to be states where there's a disconnect between the local level and the statewide level, and that's where bridging that gap is just going to take an effort. It's going to take some labor to get that done. I also remember the experience in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in Florida, in New Jersey. I remember those experiences really well. I have scars from them. And those are a part, I should have added those as parts of lessons learned from the Recovery Act. We're going to do all we can to make sure that does not happen again. At the end of the day, these things are local decisions. I want to be clear about that. They're in some cases state decisions. That's absolutely crystal clear. But we are not going to put ourselves in a position for future political changes to determine the future of these projects. We've just been through it, and we're not going to go through it. We're trying to make sure to do as much as possible not to go through it again.
Amen. Carl?
I wanted to also thank you for the vision that's being shown at the moment. It's extraordinary and remarkable. Part is a comment and then a question. You look at the Amtrak Connect's proposals and the corridors that have been proposed all over the United States, and there are numerous examples of situations in which, if the newly emerging corridors were also looked at as integral parts of the existing national network, or as expansions of it that might further the need and encourage those corridors to develop, we might get more. I gave you a couple of examples. One would be, you've shown that Amtrak Connect. We have Chicago-Louisville. We have Nashville-Atlanta, Atlanta-Savannah. There's a 120-mile gap roughly from Louisville to Nashville in there, in the inclusion of which you would have the long, desperately needed Chicago-Florida national network train that could also facilitate local use. And the other one, is most obvious to me, is Newton, Kansas down to Oklahoma City, being treated as an isolated, voided corridor with a 3 o'clock in the morning departure out of Newton and a transfer on the Southwest Chief. It's a recipe for failure. As a through route from Chicago to Texas, down through Oklahoma, through Wichita to Oklahoma City, major population centers, it's a major winner. So what vehicle might there be in this law that would enable us to do a better job of encouraging those partnerships to look beyond just a 300-mile corridor and look at its function in the national network? And is there any room in this for proposals for actual new intercity trains that would go beyond the 750-mile formula?
Yeah, well, I'll say this about the bipartisan infrastructure law in general. I think one of the reasons that we were able to get bipartisan support for a rail program was actually making sure that long-distance routes were very much a part of the rail program and will be going forward. There's no question about it. They were included and they are eligible to receive funding. And that's something that I really highlighted, I've tried to highlight in my whole tenure here, is that when it comes to rail, we're talking about conventional rail, we're talking about long distance service, we're talking about high-speed rail service. Now, they all have different funding needs and different ranges of funding, but dollars can actually go further in some of those distance miles that you talked about. The dollars can go a lot further in those places. So there's absolutely a pathway, whether it's interstate compacts that I mentioned as one route for multiple states to get together. There's Amtrak funding. There's the federal-state partnership, CRISI also. So, and then, like I mentioned, the mega projects, I mean, conceivably, several states could get together and say that we're putting in an application for a long-distance route or conventional service between multiple states. So the opportunities are there, and again, that's also where it comes in. It doesn't have to be ready right now at the end of March in 2022. These can come together in 2023, 2024. So there's an opportunity to build those things, because some of that's going to be legwork, right? Because it's not on the shelf in a lot of cases. And I want to share this with the audience here, is that the reason the Northeast Corridor is getting something equivalent to about $30 billion within the $66 billion. The Northeast Corridor states came together through the Northeast Corridor Commission and came together with a capital plan for specific projects and identified specific projects. They're going through a process right now of looking at it to make sure that they're resource constrained because they weren't, but they're going through that exercise right now, and an inventory is due in November. But I'm just indicating that as a way for the 8 states and the District of Columbia to come together on a consensus basis and put projects forward. That made it easy for the federal government to recognize the set of projects. And we knew there was a need, but for the states to actually come together and tell us that they have an agreement on these, and this is going to be a huge feat to build those projects while keeping the Northeast Corridor operational. That's the other thing we're going to do, right? And we're not going to stop service on the Northeast Corridor. So sequencing those projects are really important, but I'm just bringing that up because I know that's a massive example, but it's an example of the types of things that we're looking to do.
Okay.